Okay, let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about universal design for learning. And universal design for learning is an outgrowth of the more general concept of universal design, which actually was used in architecture and engineering and so forth as a way of addressing accessibility needs in construction. The basic issue is, or one of the issues that was people eventually realized, is that it's much easier to meet accessibility requirements when you're designing a building or a structure than it is to try to retrofit. A classic example of curve cuts for wheelchairs, that it's very easy to pour concrete in such a way so that you have these curb cuts built in, than to have to go back and cut things out and build them in later. And it's easier to build ramps into structures than it is to add ramps after the fact. And the same basic principle is used with universal design for learning. And well, first, how would people here define universal design? And how much background do you have in universal design in terms of what you know of it? Crystal, Genevieve, Jessica?
I would say I think I understand the concepts behind it, but I'm looking for more ways to implement it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same for me. I mean, trying to reach out to everybody.
Okay. And actually, that's a big part of it, that designing courses that work for everyone so that you don't need to make as many accommodations and so forth for into special cases. The definition that CAST uses, which is one of the groups that is most actively involved in universal design, is that it's a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn, which is a pretty general principle. But there's a framework. Well, and I guess, well, I've already sort of suggested one way in which this differs from accommodations, that accommodations are done after the fact, and UDL can reduce the need for accommodations by providing learning methods, learning techniques, and learning materials that will work for everyone, reducing the need for some type of accommodations. But there are some accommodations that are still going to be needed for people with specific disabilities. So it doesn't eliminate the need for accommodations, but it can mitigate it. And basically, you know, if some students need extra time, providing more time for all students is one way of addressing that issue, as just a simple example of that. We'll see some of those things as we go through this. There's three basic principles of UDL. That the goal of UDL design, UDL, is to provide multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement. And representation is basically the learning materials that you provide to students, multiple ways of getting materials to students. Action and expression, well, one way of putting it is representation is the what it is that students use to learn. Action and expression is how students engage with that material, and engagement is why they engage with the material in a sense. So multiple means of representation means we're giving students multiple ways of learning the material, multiple resources for that. Action and expression means we're giving students multiple ways of learning and expressing themselves and demonstrating their learning and engaging with the content. And multiple means of engagement is providing multiple ways in which we can connect students with the material, provoking their curiosity and helping them build connections to it. And what I thought we might do actually, and the goal is to provide an inclusive and accessible learning environment that works for everybody. And I put together a Jamboard, and if you could, actually, let me drop that into chat. Let me just grab the link, and I'm going to put it in the chat. if you can use that to suggest some things as we go through. I put a few things together, but it would be nice if we can get some additional views here, and we'll come back to that as we go through. Where basically I'm asking you to put sticky notes up or draw or do something in there to represent or to talk about some ways or some examples in which we can explore each of these things, or some ways in which we can build this into our classes. So there's 3 screens there, one for multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement. Okay, now, in terms of multiple means of representation, the main thing here is to give students lots of ways in which they can connect to the material. A simple way of doing that is to provide information in different formats. That when you use readings, make sure those readings are accessible, that digital accessibility standards are met. So it works with screen readers and so forth. And if you have PDFs that you're using in your class, make sure that they're in an accessible format and they're not just scanned images that don't have a text layer, because then students who have visual barriers won't be able to, screen readers won't be able to access them. But you can also use images, you can use videos, you can use podcasts and so forth to provide supplemental resources, because students will not all will not benefit equally from all the materials you provide. I know certainly when I remember my first exposure to linear algebra was in a college class where it was a complete series of proofs, where I really had very little intuition of all of this. But then I took an econometrics class where all these concepts of matrix inversion and the basis of a linear space and so forth all made much more sense, because I could see the connections, I could see the relevance. Providing students with different types of readings from different perspectives can help them engage with the material in ways that other readings may not connect in the same way with each individual. Providing students with support materials in the way of videos or podcasts out there can be really helpful. And you can do that by just letting them be supplemental. And you can provide feedback to students where if they find the material in the text difficult to understand, or in the text readings, you can give them some supplemental materials. You can store them in Brightspace, and you can even group them by topics and so forth, so that students can go in and watch some videos that might provide just a different perspective, a different voice that they might be able to connect to better than the readings or the lectures or other things that might be provided. And students generally appreciate having those resources. I was trying to look at statistics on this because I've seen many of them, but in general, a very large proportion of students will use captions when watching educational videos. I saw one statistic, and the reason why it's such a large range is these are all based on studies from various vendors of video streaming services or surveys of students and so forth. And you get a pretty wide range of estimates. That the low estimate is 35% and the high is 75%. There was also a study that I saw of British TV watchers who that found that 80% of the people who turn captions on when watching TV do not have hearing impairments. So 4 out of 5 of the people who use captions when watching movies, TV shows, and so forth do it anyway. And when students are asked why they use captions, if they don't have hearing impairments, some say it helps them focus. It makes it easier to connect what they're hearing, especially if there's technical terms, with the actual words and terms that are used. And some students will be watching a video in a library where they may not have headphones with them, or where they may not have speaker capability. So having the captions make it possible to focus on that in ways that they might otherwise, or if students are working in noisy environments. So when you use videos, make sure the videos have captions, or if you create videos, make sure they have that. Another thing that's really helpful is if you can find resources that connect to the lived experience of the students in your classroom. That if you're going to deal with controversial issues, or well, pretty much any issues, letting students see the issues from multiple perspectives, make it easier for all students to connect with that. If there's issues where some people are affected differently by certain policies, for example, this is a pretty generic, example, but having students hear the voices from multiple perspectives of the people involved in the issue can really help them find connections to it in ways that they might not if they were just reading a textbook discussion of some concept. This is one of the places where decolonizing your syllabus can be really helpful, so that some of the voices that students are hearing in the classes are coming from groups that they can connect to, so that they don't feel like they're outside of the experience and so forth. And in general, by providing students with multiple types of resources, we call that multimodal representation, there's a lot of work that shows that that results in longer term recall, so that when students read something, they watch some videos on it, they perhaps listen to some podcasts on it, it gives them multiple ways of connecting to concepts, and it makes them, it increases the amount that they're likely to recall. And one thing that is somewhat troubling is that a lot of the advocates of UDL will sometimes descend into arguments that you have to teach the students learning styles. And basically, the research on learning styles provides pretty compelling evidence that the whole concept is just nonsense, that in general, people who are classified as being visual learners do learn from visual materials, but they don't learn more or less than anyone who is not classified as a visual learner. There are literally hundreds of studies that debunk this whole learning styles argument. So in a sense, we're all visual learners, we're all kinesthetic learners, we're all, all those different categories, and there are dozens of categorizations that are used, and they're very profitable for the people who sell those tests. But in general, there's no statistically significant differences between people who are classified as one type of learner and others. And basically, the issue is that we all benefit from seeing concepts expressed in multiple modalities. So in general, multimodal representation is a good thing, not just for people with specific diagnosed learning styles, but for everyone, because really the research suggests we all tend to learn in similar ways. We may have different preferences in terms of how we learn material, but in general, there's no statistically significant difference across people in learning. Okay, the multiple means of action and expression is basically giving students different ways of engaging with the material. And, you could use papers, which is the most traditional way of doing that, but perhaps something worth considering is an unessay. And basically an unessay is anything other than an essay requirement. Students could give class presentations, they could present concepts to the class, they could create videos, they could create podcasts, they could create games. In many classes where people do unessays, students will create board games or some interactive games that illustrate the concepts that they're learning. You could have them create infographics, cartoons, and there's lots of apps out there that they can use to do this, either on the desktop or laptops or on mobile devices. You can even have students do interpretive dance or songs. In one of the classes that I taught at Duke for many years, for at least 15 years or so, I gave students a capstone project, which was to take some of the concepts they learned in the class and present it however they'd like. And in 3 or 4 years, some of the students chose to do interpretive dance combined with songs that were actually very clever and illustrated the concepts that they were using remarkably well. I gave them a link to some videos in the Dance Your PhD competition, which are available on YouTube. And in general, I was surprised that people chose that because that's probably a little bit more difficult, but I've had students write songs about concepts and create videos and share them with the class. And that can work really nicely. And students often find it more engaging. And as an instructor, it's often much more fun to evaluate some of this work than it is to evaluate still another term paper. And also, I suppose, in a world of GPT, having students express themselves in other modes might get around some of those issues, especially if they find the activity to be enjoyable. Although ChatGPT could be used to help create any of these. And if you're going to use give students multiple ways of demonstrating their learning, you could either create rubrics that work for everything, or you can work with students saying, these are the learning objectives that we have to demonstrate that you've achieved. And you could sit down with students and in class, and as a class activity, co-create rubrics that will evaluate this in ways that can work with multiple types of projects. So it doesn't really matter how they demonstrate the specific modality in which they demonstrate what they're learning, as long as they're able to show that they've mastered the concept, that they can see how it's applied, and you can create terms or you can create and design these things in a way that will work with any type of presentation that students choose to do. And again, it tends to be much more enjoyable for students and for faculty. I've enjoyed it much more. In my capstone class in economics this past semester, I had students create podcasts. I gave them a choice. For the previous 4 or 5 years, they have created a joint book project. This year, they chose a series of podcasts, and they worked in groups of 2 or 3, and they created 2 podcasts over the course of the semester, in addition to doing a lot of other things. But this was something that they discovered was a lot more work than they had anticipated. They thought it was going to be easier than writing a chapter in a book. But they said if we had known how much work it was, we might have realized that perhaps the other would have been easier. But then I said, well, I asked them, would you still have wanted to do this if you knew how much work was going to be involved in this? Because they had a whole series of stages. They had to put together an outline, then they had to put together a bibliography, then an annotated bibliography, and then a draft of their arguments and so forth. And it was pretty much as much work as it would have been writing a more formal chapter or a term paper. But they said they much preferred this because they had never done anything like this before. And that creates a little bit more of a memorable experience than writing still another term paper after they've done that in many of their classes over the years. Okay, multiple means of engagement and again, these blend together and overlap a little bit. The main thing about this, or the main issue here, is you want to create inclusive ways in which students can engage with the material in ways that will work for all learners. And there's a number of things you can do. One of the most important strategies, and this goes back to the evidence-based aspect of universal design for learning, is to use active learning activities. That active learning increases student learning compared to listening to a lecture. Students will generally find active learning activities a bit more challenging. They don't believe they learn as much that way, but they do learn significantly more when they're actively engaged with the material that you're trying to have them master in some way. And there's many, many forms of those activities. And you can vary the activity. And there's been a lot of work recently with incorporating playful activities, some gaming activities. You could you can gamify your class, or you could just have some form of randomness introduced into the activities, which tends to make it a little bit more engaging. If you fully gamify, you could have a leaderboard where students have names that they know, but the class doesn't, so you don't do any FERPA violations there. But you could also have students engage in classroom experiments, or if it's a science class, direct experiments. Or you can, depending on the nature of the discipline, you might be able to set up a problem-based learning approach where they're actually facing a series of challenges that they have to work through as a group to resolve. And as they're doing that, they're learning the content. And one of the key points about universal design for learning is that we know that students come in with very varied strengths. Some have really strong content knowledge, some have less. Some students are very good at communicating, some are less good. Some students are very good at organizing material and so forth. And in general, with the universal design for learning, we try to leverage the strengths of those students so that they'll work in groups, they collaborate with others. And in general, all the students get to use some of the skills in this collaboration and encourage that all students have a specific role within the groups. And you can ask them, what they're relatively strong at. If you have a series of roles, you might define roles or have students themselves define roles that match the things that they're relatively better at. But in general, working together increases the amount that all students learn. Even just simple peer collaboration on solving problems can be really effective in increasing learning for everyone. If some students understand the concepts better than others, when they're explaining it to students who don't have as much prior background in the material, the act of explaining it to other people reinforces their own learning. It deepens their learning because they have to take the concepts that they've understood to some level and convert it into a form that makes sense to other students. For the students who haven't as strong a background in the topic, the act of having explained to them by someone at a similar level of cognitive development, a similar level of understanding who just recently learned it themselves, is generally much more effective than having an instructor explain the material to them. There's this phenomenon known as the curse of knowledge, that the more you know about this subject, the harder it is to explain things in terms that a novice will understand, because it's really hard sometimes to see what the barriers are when it just becomes automatic to you at some stage. And there's a lot of studies that confirm that. There was a really simple one that was done in an experiment a number of years ago, where the researcher took, I think it was about 30 songs, and she asked the students in the group or in the research group in the experiment to tap out the basic melody pattern on the table, and they were asked, how likely is it that you think that the other party will be able to guess from this list of songs which song it was just from the pattern? And the people who were doing the tapping generally said that they thought it was half or more of the students would be able to select the song based on the way in which they were tapping it out, because while they were tapping it, they were hearing the song in their head. But in general, the probability of the people who were listening to the tapping guessing it correctly turned out to be exactly 1 in 30, or roughly 1 in 30. That essentially people were not at all able to identify the song just from listening to the tapping pattern, because the issue is the expert, the person who knew that song and was listening to it in their head, was able to, well, it was obvious to them. But for the people who were just hearing it, that was not sufficient information for them to identify the song just from the rhythmic pattern. And there's lots of other experiments like that. Another classic experiment with that was, I think it was the University of Maryland. They had students work in a very large biology class. Half of the students work with a graduate TA and half of the students work with an undergraduate TA. They measured their learning at the beginning of the semester and again at the end. And what they found is the largest learning gains occurred, well, there were two groups that had the largest learning gains. That the students who worked with an undergraduate TA learned more over the course of the semester than students who work with a graduate TA. But they found the learning gains were actually the largest for the undergraduate TAs who benefited from that act of explaining it to others. And so, working in collaborative learning benefits all students. And one other thing about active learning strategies is they benefit all students in every study that I've seen, but the largest benefits disproportionately are for first-gen students, for Pell eligible students, and students from underrepresented minority groups. So in general, active learning activities benefit everyone, but they also narrow those equity gaps that we're seeing so significantly out there now. Another thing is you want to make sure, and this is really challenging, that you want to offer activities with varied levels of challenge, because we want to make sure that all students are challenged, that they're all engaged. You know, there's that zone of, what was his name? The zone of proximal, Zygotsky. Zygotsky? Or a name very close to that, the zone of proximal development, that if something is too challenging, people get discouraged and give up. If something is too easy, students don't learn very much from it because they get bored. You want to make sure that all students are challenging, and it's very difficult to design activities that will work for everyone. But you can give students perhaps a mix of activities. And for those students who do have stronger backgrounds, you might face them, or you might nudge them into selecting problems or activities that are a little bit more challenging. For students who perhaps are struggling a bit more with the material, you might give them activities that will help them develop their understanding, but that won't pose as much of a barrier to their progress. And you can do that if you're working within groups, though, a lot of that is taken care of because they can provide mutual support through that material. And that's probably the easiest way to get around that issue of students coming in with different levels of prior preparation in the content. And another thing in general, and this is something that goes way beyond just universal design, is that students don't know what to expect from students don't generally know what their instructors expect of them, that we have pretty good ideas of what we would like to see in student work, but students don't generally have that unless they've had a lot of prior preparation in similar types of classes. And many of our students have not gone through a college prep environment where those expectations had a chance to be developed. And this is especially true in more traditional type classes where students have 3 or 4 exams, where students don't know what the exams are going to be on. And the first exam is partly getting a feel for what types of things the instructors are going to be asking. And if you happen to guess correctly, you do well and so forth. If you didn't guess correctly, you're already operating at a disadvantage. And with all activities that we ask students to do, we should make clear exactly what they're expected to do. And there's lots of ways of doing that. One is you can give them practice problems throughout the course. Another is you can give them examples in terms of written requirements, in terms of videos, in terms of other projects. You can give them examples of what high quality work looks like. But if you're going to do that, make sure you provide a variety of those examples, because if you provide one example of a video, for example, that students have created, you'll end up with all the students who create videos doing a clone of that type of work. You want to show students that there's many ways of meeting the learning objectives, and they don't have to go into a narrow pathway. But students, if we can provide a more transparent learning environment where students know what we expect, it's much easier for students to meet those expectations. And students are happier when they're able to move towards those expectations right away. And we're happier when we get higher quality work that's much more engaging for us to read and to evaluate than work that goes off in a direction which isn't very productive. And if you have larger projects in your class, scaffolding them and giving students feedback at each stage is really helpful. I mentioned with the podcast project that I had used in my capstone course, or similarly in the book project before, students do a little bit of work every week on that, and then they get some feedback that can help them in the next stage of the project. And by doing that, and the early stages, the stakes are incredibly low. If it's a 300-point project, let's say, it might be 5% for the first week of work. And then the bibliography goes up just a little bit. The annotated bibliography, the stakes are just a little bit higher, but at each stage, they have a chance to go back and correct that as they move to the next stage. And often I let them go back and redo any one of those stages, because again, if they get off to a weak start, it's a bit harder to recover. And just psychologically, if they start getting some really low scores early, and certainly with things like a bibliography, I'll get a lot of things that just come off of the web from various blog posts, and even though I ask that they use peer-reviewed citations, and I show them how to use, well, in economics, we have several resources. EconLit is the major one, but there's also research papers in economics, and there's, Google Scholar as well. I show them how to find good resources. Some students will just do a Google search or a ChatGPT search and won't find, things that are really appropriate. So I remind them that these are supposed to be peer-reviewed research that they use, because this is a senior level project. And then they often will go back and redo it and move forward from there. But the key is that a key point here is that students can make mistakes, learn from those mistakes with either no penalty or a very trivial impact on their overall evaluation in a class. So that can make a big difference in student success. And let students experiment to fail, and to normalize that notion that students will try things, they'll make mistakes, and remind them that that's how learning takes place. That in general, progress in any discipline comes from people trying new things, seeing how they work, and moving forward to build on that. And that's something, looks like I think it got cut off there, but basically normalizing the issue of learning from mistakes along the way is part of how learning takes place for everyone, and students should expect that to be a normal part of the learning process. And that's not generally the message they receive when they come into college, that in general, they think they have to get things right the first time, and if they don't, they're not very good at something. And breaking that mindset is really helpful in encouraging a growth mindset. So a few principles with implementing UDL. It's easiest to incorporate UDL when you're building a course. If you're building a new course or doing a new project, it's much easier than to try to go back and redesign everything from the ground up. And the same is true with accessibility. One approach that pretty much everyone advocates now is something that Tom Tobin suggested, which is a +1 approach. That if you're giving students one way to do an assignment right now, maybe the next time you give them a second option. If you're having discussions in your class, one option is each week, instead of just giving them one topic that the whole class is discussing, give them a different an alternative, so that they're both within the same discussion forum, but you might have two different topics that they can address, where they can participate in one track or another, or basically just give them multiple threads, give them some starting threads in the discussion, and let them pick one of those to discuss, so that they're still working on the same topic, but they might be applying it in different ways or applying it in different applications. And give students the opportunity to reflect and to make some connections on their own. If the readings that you have are not very diverse and so forth, ask students to reflect on how this material might be relevant to their own lives. How might this be useful to them in the future? How might it be in the future education or their future careers? Because the more we can help students understand that there is a reason for why we're doing this stuff, the more beneficial it is. And I think that's pretty much all I had. We'll look at the Jamboard in just a second. But I did also put together this research source doc. I'll put the link to it in chat. And this just has some links to UDL resources. And I'm going to put it right there. Okay, and if we can just jump over to that for a second. Here we go. There's a link to CAST, the National Center on Universal Design for Learning. Oops, I didn't mean to open that. It looks like I did, but UDL Exchange, where people can share and explore UDL lesson plans, UDL on campus, the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, and a whole host of other resources there. And if you really want to learn more about UDL, there's a Think UDL podcast with Lillian Nave at Appalachian State University. It's a bi-weekly podcast that's been out there for a few years now with UDL topics every week. One of probably the most popular books on UDL is Tom Tobin's and Kay Beuling's book, Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone. It's a nice, easy read, and that's where they advocate that +1 strategy. And there's another book by Bracken and Novak, Transforming for Higher Education Through Universal Design for Learning. That's a series of essays written by people, well, an international collection of people who work on it. Oop, and there's a typo there. Tom Tobin was also on our podcast about 3 years ago now. But he provides a nice quick summary of UDL there. So now let's go over to the Jamboard and see what people have put there. Let's see. Okay, so nothing on there. Nothing there. And the third one has a number of things. Okay, so yeah, polling activities can be useful. And a nice thing about polling is you get to see where all the students are. You know, you get to see their views on a topic, and also a nice way of checking understanding and that helping checking on what students understand and what they're struggling with is useful for you as an instructor, but it's also useful for the students too. It helps them become more aware of what they understand and what they don't. And also, you know, in terms of attitudes and so forth, it can be really useful. Art can be really useful. One of the areas in which I don't have a growth mindset is in art. Last year, 3 years ago, I was at a SUNY conference on instruction and technology where they had a sip and paint activity. And I was convinced to sign up for some friends who were going. But I was thrilled because the artist didn't show up, but the wine did. So we had a really nice, fun evening just talking about, you know, a whole variety of things, but we didn't have to do any painting, which I found more enjoyable, but students might find expressing concepts through art to be useful. Gamification approaches can be really useful. Role-playing is another thing that can be really useful. What is that approach? Reacting to the past approach that has learning role-playing games in a wide variety of disciplines. And yes, collaborating with students on creating assignments, rubrics, or grading system gives them ownership. And in this capstone course that I taught, and I've been doing this for a number of years, because it's a capstone, they should have learned a wide variety of economic topics. And what we do on the first night of the class is basically build the syllabus, including what the topics will be that they'll be focusing on that semester. We pick generally 10 or 11 topics where they select the topics that provide applications of microeconomics or macroeconomic concepts. And then I pick some readings where they present those readings every week and discuss them and so forth. But the fact that they got to choose the areas of focus are all areas of applied economics. gives them this ownership in the class, which gets them really invested in it. My attendant, well, with the exception of one student who disappeared in the first week, I believe there was only one other time when one student was missing. So it was nearly 100% attendance every week, partly because they were presenting things, but also because these were topics they wanted to learn more about and so forth. And with a podcast, again, they chose topics within, well, they formed groups based on topics, but because they chose those topics, they were much more engaged with them. And that sense of ownership is something that students really value. Gives them more of a sense of autonomy. It's not something being done to them, but they're getting to shape their own learning in some way. And that's really valuable. And that's all I've got. So any questions or comments or thoughts?
John, I was going to ask about a resource bank where we could, kind of adopt strategies. And sorry about the baby.
Oh, that's okay.
So, you already shared something, and that's good. But I think for me, the course or class observations that we've been doing has been really helpful because I've observed a couple of your online courses and I could adopt strategies directly. So like the metacognitive cafe has been very helpful. And something along those lines would be more helpful to me. So I was wondering if you could, suggest things along those lines I could incorporate, directly given.
Okay, so yeah, you'd like to see some examples from a class? Is that?
Yes, basically more things that we can easily adopt, than all of this is good, but then it's a long route, more theoretical. I'm just wondering, something like the class observations has been very good for me. Like when I get to see how you've implemented all of this in your class, it gives me a sense of, I see how it's working, how students, because I observed your online classes and I see how it's working and how students are responding to these. And if you could suggest certain things along those lines that I could easily implement into my classes, because basically we have to cover content. For instance, if I'm teaching microeconomics, I have to cover all of the content, try to cover the technicalities. At the same time, I'm doing active learning, so we solve problems in the classroom. But then with something like discussions and getting some group work in there, how do I really implement these given the time, period that we have? So if I could see, how
So how much of
that works, yeah.
So I think the question then is how much of the work is done in class and how much is done outside of the class?
Yes.
Okay, that varies. That generally, when in the capstone course, what I did is I gave them some time in the first or the second week of class for them, or the second week when they picked their groups for the topics, I gave them some time in class to come up with a group plan, a strategy, to allocate the tasks, to decide how they were going to meet, how they were going to communicate, and so forth. And from then on, most of their actual meetings took place outside of class. Sometimes because I had students, some of whom were in Syracuse, some were working full-time or nearly full-time because this was a night class. It was hard for some of them to get together in person. So they just met over Zoom. And when they recorded the podcast, they recorded them over Zoom in some cases. Other students just picked times to meet because the groups they were in were not only producing podcasts, they were also doing weekly presentations on journal articles. Actually, I can show you a little bit of the schedule for that. I did give them some time periodically to address some of the issues they were working with in class as needed, but much of it was done outside. Let me pop over to, I'll drag this over. I'm opening up the capstone course that students were working in this semester. And let me see. So I can look, if we go down to content, I can show you, oh, the syllabus actually wasn't in here. It was done in Google Docs. So, so let me just pick, let me show you the types of things they did in class. And here, the first week, the first full week of new material was to discuss behavioral economics. And there I had them, I gave them the readings, but they were all on hypothesis. And in hypothesis, they annotated the document. So they discussed it before they came to class. So they were already engaged in a preliminary discussion. This is graded material in here. So, so basically they read the content and they discussed it before they came to class within the document itself. And then they gave presentations on it and people would ask them questions and so forth. I'd have to dig deep into the, I'd have to go through my Google Drive to find the actual syllabus, but that was done. I created a group Google Drive folder and then separate and subfolders for each of the groups where all their work was done in stages within their subdocument, within their subfolder. And then it was shared back to the class when they were ready to do it. So for example, oh, let me see. Where was it? That was from a previous semester. Now, this is probably not the best example to show that. Let me show one other thing though. Let me go over to a different class just to show some of the ways where you can build in multiple ways of displaying content. I'm going to switch over to one of my online classes from the spring, which when I do face-to-face classes, it's actually a very similar structure. For each of the material, for each module of the course, that corresponds roughly to chapters in the textbook. When you go into the course module, you have, let me go to one of the earlier modules. They're in reverse order, so the most recent one pops up as they do it. Let's go here. So what happens is I give them an overview of the types of things they're expected to learn or an overview of the module. Then they go to a module overview that tells them exactly what they're expected to do that week with an overview of it, the learning objectives, the things that they should be able to do by the end of the module, and then the required tasks, which includes an adaptive learning textbook from McGraw-Hill. Then they have 2 discussion forums and so forth. But if we go further down, let me just jump back up here. So much of the basic learning they get from the textbook, but then there's also these little mini lectures, some text-based notes that I put together on the topics, so these are subtopics. So there's some basic material in here, that they can expand it in an accordion file just so they can go back and see my notes on some of the topics if that's helpful. And then they can also, somewhere in here, there's also optional video resources and optional web resources, which gives them multiple ways of reviewing the material. So, they can go to YouTube videos if they need some additional supports or some optional web materials if that would be helpful. So, and these are often, these can be helpful. Again, it's just providing students with the resources that they need in a format that might be useful, and giving them multiple ways of connecting the material is what I tried to implement there basically. So that's, that initial stage of a UDL, I've done a fair amount of in this course by giving them multiple types of resources available. And many of the discussions that they do involve discussing either podcasts or recent blog posts or something similar about some economic issue that's in the news connected to the labor market, because this was a course in labor economics. That wasn't exactly what you asked, but I have tried to build some of this in. Some of them I've done better than others, but again, the +1 strategy can be really helpful.
No, John, this is actually excellent. So that's exactly what I was saying. I kind of, maybe just like we are saying, giving samples to the students and letting them know what, a good work actually looks like. It's what I'm trying to ask for over here. And that's exactly, I want to see what an excellent or almost excellent setup looks like based on your syllabus and what you're actually doing that's working in class. And I think that works for me better. And thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, well, thanks for joining, and we'll see you in some later sessions. Let me stop the recording.